McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and we're going to be talking about polls and what you need to know about them. And here's my co-host, Jim Falk, to give you an overview.
Well, like you, during this election season, Dennis and I have been receiving lots of calls from pollsters, and thanks to caller ID, most of them go unanswered. Today, we're going to explore the value of polling, not just from the perspective of the candidate, but what do they mean for you, for us, the citizen, the voter? We're going to ask, how do you tell if a poll is legitimate? What about the impact of technology? And knowing that President Trump's margin of victory was missed in 2016, should we have confidence in what we're hearing about 2020? Dennis, will you please introduce our guest and let's get going.
I will. Thank you, Jim. And we have two outstanding individuals to talk about this issue. And we always talk about political polls, but there are surveys and polls about other items too. If we have time, we'll get into that. First, welcome Lynne Stokes. She's a professor in the Department of Statistical Science at Southern Methodist University here in Dallas. And she's the director of its new Data Science Institute. Her area of specialization in statistics is sampling and measurement error. She currently works on projects ranging not just from politics, but the red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico to Medicare claims. Well, Lynne, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
And joining us from somewhere in Pennsylvania is Scott Keeter. Scott's a senior survey advisor at the Pew Research Center, and he is an expert on public opinion and political behavior and the co-author of 4 books on those subjects. He's also a past president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, or AAPOR as it's called. And in 2016, he received their highest achievement award for outstanding contributions to the field of public opinion research. So Scott, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dennis. It's great to be with you here live from Arlington, Virginia.
A question to start. We hear about polls, we hear about surveys, we hear about how these things are done. Give us a little bit of background on what Pew is and how it gets involved in these things, and then sort of differentiate between polls and surveys that we read in the paper and online.
Sure. Well, I work for the Pew Research Center in Washington. It is a nonpartisan and nonprofit fact tank. We try to distinguish ourselves from the think tanks, not that we don't think, but our goal is to provide facts that help inform decision-making and help inform the public. And to do that, we use a variety of tools, but the most common one are surveys. We do random sample surveys of the public and of special populations to try to shed light on issues of public concern. And surveys are more generic in that they can include polls, but they could also be things like, well, let's say the decennial census that's still going on, that's a survey.
Okay, great. That's an interesting distinction. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
So Lynne, tell us a bit about what you do at Southern Methodist University here in Dallas.
Well, I'm a professor in the Statistical Science Department, so I teach a lot of statistics, and I teach a course in sampling and have for a long time. But the new venture is an initiative at SMU that is called the Data Science Institute, and I'm the first director. And our goal is to try to encourage interdisciplinary research. There's a lot of people on our campus that are doing research in data science, but within their own field. So we have a statistics department, we have a computer science department, we even have people who are doing data science in history. They call it digital humanities. And so we don't talk to each other enough. And so the Data Science Institute is a way for us to collaborate better and to do research on larger problems.
Sounds like it's very important, especially right now. I wonder if you could really give us a brief but good understanding of what happened in 2016 because polls really did sort of get a bad rap then.
Yes, I think that there's still, we aren't completely sure what happened, but APOR, the organization that we just heard about a minute ago, did a kind of post-mortem on what went wrong. And the finding was basically that they found support for a couple of hypotheses about what might have gone wrong. First of all, actually nothing went wrong at the national level. In fact, the polls at the sort of an average of polls showed that at the national level, at least, the percent for Clinton was estimated to be very close to what it ended up being. I think they estimated that she would have about a 3% edge, and she only had about a 2% edge. But that actually is a bit better than most national polls. Where it went off the rails was at the state level, and there were state polls. The state polls actually did a little bit worse than they have in past years. So APOR looked at the data and tried to figure out why that happened. And they came up with two hypotheses that seemed to have the most support. One was that 2016 was a little odd in that a lot of people made their decision in the last week. And of those, and so the polls didn't capture that. The average of the polls didn't capture that when they came before the last week.
And when you look at this, you really see that over time, polling has improved at the national level.
That's correct. That's correct. Probably the methods are getting better over time, and people are learning how to do polls better. But anyway, at the state level, there was this misestimation because they captured, a lot of the polls were averaged from the week, before the prior week. And of the people who made a decision in the last week, they broke for Trump, especially in some of the swing states. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin in particular had, I think, a 30% edge for Trump of those who made their decision in the last week. So that was one hypothesis. Another that seemed to have some support is that some of the important polls didn't wait for education. And in this particular election, education was predictive of who the voter ended up voting for. People with college degrees voted in higher rates for Clinton, and people who respond tend to have higher education. So they didn't wait properly to make the sample look like the population as well as they could have. So those seem to be the ones.
I was reading that weighting is risky and very tricky and varies greatly from different pollsters.
It does vary greatly. They have their own, each of them has their own proprietary system for weighting. The reason you have to wait, if you were just able to pick a sample of 1,000 and everybody talked to you randomly, pick 1,000 randomly and everybody talked to you, you wouldn't have a problem. The problem is that some people, in fact, a lot of people, like you said, you just don't answer your phone, so they don't answer, and then the sample ends up getting to be not looking like the population. And so the way to take care of that, the way that samplers take care of that, is that they wait for characteristics, like they want the sample to have the right fraction of females and males that the whole population, the voting population does. They want them to have the same demographic, racial groups that the population does. The thing is, you have to figure out what all to wait for and what's going to matter in the vote. So that's the issue.
Lynne, that just sounds wonderful. I'm sure that we can statistically figure all this stuff out with people's psychology, don't you think? Scott, you've heard what Lynne has to say about this, and so what is it that makes a good poll, number one, and then secondly, based upon what we're talking about here, we always hear about this margin of error. What does that mean, and how important is that to our viewer?
Well, a good poll is one that gives everybody in the population a chance to be included, and preferably a known chance. That is, if you're sampling randomly, you're almost always giving everybody an equal chance. But as Lynne said, because people respond to surveys at different rates, better educated people more likely to take surveys and so forth, then you have to make corrections. So one mark of a good poll, in addition to giving a properly representative group of people in the population a chance to be in there, is that they do weight, and they do weight on a variety of characteristics that can go wrong in the data collection process. Another mark of a good poll, if I'm trying to assess a poll that I'm not familiar with, is whether they are transparent about their methodology. Do they provide a list of all the questions that were asked in the order in which they were asked and what the responses were? Do they tell you how they weighted the data? Do they tell you how the data were collected? Was it by mail? Was it a phone survey? Did they include cell phones, which are essential in order to cover younger people, young families and so forth? So if you can't find those things out about a poll, you ought to be skeptical about them.
Well, the thing I think that people have a problem with is that they see all these polls, they're coming particularly on TV and online, and often all you can see is maybe the source. How important is the source in terms of what we should be feeling less skeptical about, let's say?
You know, I'm a big believer that the source really matters. Polling has gotten to be kind of the Wild West these days because the barriers to entry into polling are very low. Anybody who can gin up a website can conduct something that they call a poll, but it may be of very low quality. And so you do need to be skeptical. That's why I tend to trust the polls that are done by the major news organizations. And I'm talking here about across the political spectrum, from the Fox News pollsters, who I know and are very competent, to the people who poll for NBC. They use a bipartisan team to do their polls, to CNN, and of course Pew Research Center. But the one thing about trusting a poll by an organization, and here I would also throw in university polls, university survey centers that do polls, and oftentimes they do them in conjunction with news organizations. They all have a reputation to defend. They have to, they have no incentive to put their thumb on the scale, because if they're wrong, everybody will know that after the fact and they'll lose credibility. So I think that the major news organization polls and the major university center polls are by and large trustworthy because of these factors.
Lynne, how large does a sample have to be legitimate? And does it vary depending on what questions you're trying to get the answer to?
Well, the sample sizes determine how big the margin of error is. We talked about margin of error earlier. If you have a random sample of about 1,000, that'll give you a margin of error of around 3%. If you have a random sample of around 500, it'll give you a margin of error of around 5%.
We're such a mobile society, and maybe I'm missing something here, but as we begin to eliminate landlines, I know that I can have my area code here and be living in another state. So how do you determine where someone is living? I know you can track cell phones, but I don't think you're doing that when you're conducting polls.
At national polls, they don't actually care if they're making an estimate at the national level. For state polls, that is important, and that could be a source of error, I suppose, at the state level, if someone has moved and kept their own old area code or something and has a way of not telling about it. So I suppose that.
Scott, is there any way to get around that?
Well, I think that the approach that a lot of pollsters are taking to dealing with this problem is to use what are called voter files. The 2000 election led to a lot of reform, with Congress passing laws that help to establish unified procedures across the states for keeping voter registration records. And so now there are records in every state that are accessible to the campaigns and to researchers. Now, these files don't contain who you voted for, but they contain information about you, your name, your address, your age, in some places your race or ethnicity, and many of them contain phone numbers. In addition, commercial companies have taken these files and they've used other databases to add phone numbers to it. And so for state pollsters, or even more difficult, people who are doing congressional district polling, they almost exclusively will use these voter files because they can get voters who they know live in the state and phone numbers associated with them, including cell phone numbers that will help them to actually reach those people. The other method that's being used, though, that's quite interesting and relatively new, although it sounds old tech, is surveys by mail using these same voter files, or even the U.S. Postal Service's master list of addresses. You can draw samples of households in a place, send them letters and requests to go online and take a survey. And that method actually gets higher response rates than telephone surveys are getting now. So those are two ways that we've tried to skin that cat as it's become more and more difficult in the cell phone era.
Yeah, well, let me ask Lynn, you and Scott both to react to this question. And that is, we talked about technology being different now and maybe trying to do something online in addition to what he just said there. And then secondly, it's a program we're going to do in the next week or two on mail-in balloting. And so you're talking about people, at least 4 years ago, making up their mind at the last minute. Now you've got people who are actually going to start voting right away. I mean, how is this going to skew all these polls?
Well, I think it is going to make it harder because it's a moving target. That's another difference between polling and other kinds of surveys, which was one of the questions you asked earlier. If you ask someone some unchanging characteristic about themselves, like their education level, for example, well, it changes, but slowly over time, it's not a moving target. But polling is different. So not only do you have to estimate something about the population, you have to estimate something that's changing. So it is difficult, and the timing, I suspect that this timing is going to make it even harder to say at a given point in time. You know, some of the people some haven't even made up their mind yet. So it is kind of a mix that is making the thing that you're estimating a little bit wavy, or a little bit unstable, I would say.
Scott, one of the things I was reading about was the so-called Trump shy phenomenon, the shy Trump phenomenon, where people would not be really honest to a pollster. Is that a factor?
Well, it's certainly getting a lot of attention. It got a lot of attention as a potential explanation for why some of the state polls fell short in 2016. But it's important to note that this is not a new phenomenon. The idea that people would not answer polls honestly because of embarrassment or what we call social desirability bias dates all the way back to the 80s, when African-American Mayor Tom Bradley in Los Angeles ran for California governor, led in the polls and lost. And I experienced this firsthand in some of the polling that I was doing in Virginia in 2009, that year, that our polls showed that Wilder was going to win by a lot, and he did win, but he only won by a very small amount. So fast forward through the aughts to the election of Barack Obama, lots of people were afraid that people were going to say they were going to vote for Obama, but then when they got in the polling booth, they wouldn't do it. That did not happen. In 2016, we did a lot of postmortem work to try to understand whether there had been a shy Trump effect. We didn't see any signs of it. We compared people who'd been interviewed in person with people who had been interviewed online. We didn't see any difference in their willingness to express support for Trump or not. That's one possible way. Trump and the Republican Senate candidates sort of equally over or underperformed their polls, which suggests that it wasn't a specifically Trump phenomenon. The one thing that I think pollsters worry about is that there may be difficulty getting people who are pro-Trump into their samples in the first place. And in that sense, it's a genuine embodiment of the shy Trump notion that people might say, those polls are all corrupt, I'm not going to take it. But you know, if this kind of thing were really a problem, I don't think polling would have had such a good track record on balance across such a long period of time, because controversial candidates have been with us forever.
So both of your organizations I think are well funded, but one thing that you're seeing now is so many newspapers don't have the ability, the capacity to fund polls as they used to, and you're really not seeing that. It's really only the major newspapers that are issuing polls. What type of impact does that have?
Yeah, I think that's a major problem. You know, even 10 years ago and certainly 20 years ago, major news organizations would have a polling team. Now they might have one polling professional on staff. And that, you know, that has an impact. And it's not just in terms of conducting the polls themselves. It's also in helping the reporters and editors to vet other polls that come across the transom. There's always somebody who sends you a poll and says, hey, this is a really interesting poll. Why don't you write about it? And, you know, one of the things that pollsters working for news organizations used to do is they would go to, they would look up the track record of the poll or who did it or what the methodology was. And they'd say, don't go with this. This is not a good poll. You shouldn't report on this, or this is gold standard, roll with it. So I think that's been a major thing. Now, it's one piece of good news is that because of the internet, we're finding cheaper ways to do polls. The online polls that are out there, some of them are not very good. Some of them are pretty good. Or we have a hybrid method. We recruit people through random sampling using address-based sampling, and then get people to join our panel and take the surveys online. So it's much cheaper than recruiting a fresh batch of people each time. And you're seeing that increasingly being used. There are probably 4 or 5 major organizations using that type of methodology in this cycle.
Yeah, Lynn, I remember, was it Mark Twain or somebody who said there's lies, damn lies in statistics? Was it? I don't remember who it was, but anyway, you know the quote.
Yeah.
And so what we hear sometimes are what we call push polls, or a word I hadn't heard since I got it from the two of you, is frugging or fruging. Is that right? And then tell us what those are, and then how that relates to what some people will say is fake news.
Yeah. Well, there are fake polls. They range all the way from completely fake, where people just make up the data. That was sort of uncovered. I think Nate Silver uncovered that with some data analysis. An organization called Delphi Analytica, I believe, who they decided that they actually just made up the data and presented polls. So it ranges all the way from that, which I would say is a fake poll, to a push poll is one where it's really negative campaigning disguised as a poll. They are say derogatory things about one of the candidates and then pretend that it's a poll. It's not really a poll at all. Another one is where they try to raise money. That's the frugging thing. They will ask some questions. They're usually also kind of slanted questions. And then at the end, they ask you for money. So that's just fundraising disguised as a poll. So, and then there's just, as Scott said, there's just some that are just incompetent because the barrier is so low to entry that I do think that there's more organizations who sometimes people think anyone can do a poll now that you can just get cheap software that does surveys. So there's a range of bad polls, and sometimes you can tell by looking at the questions. So that's one thing for a viewer to think about.
So what about aggregating of polls? You see that a lot more now.
Yeah, 538 is the one that you see a lot, you hear about a lot. It's a kind of statistical modeling operation where you you kind of take an average where the average is based on the quality of the polls. So some of them, they have different models for combining the polls. Some of the models work well, some of the models don't work so well. And so that also happened in 2016. The 538 one turned out to actually be fairly good. It's not sampling itself, it's statistical modeling behind the sampling. So they use the polls as data, and then they figure out how much to pay attention to each one. So it's actually a very interesting idea, and I think it works well. It'll get better over time. It's kind of new.
Okay, Scott, we just have about 30 seconds left. Give that viewer some either things that you want to emphasize or something that you haven't had a chance to mention yet.
You know, the one thing that I always like to say, and it comes as no surprise from a lifelong pollster, is that I think people ought to understand that polls are a lot more than just horse race prediction devices. They're a way for us to get a view of what ordinary people are thinking. There are a lot of biases in our system. People who have more money, more education, who feel more strongly about things, their voices are much louder in the system. Polling, when it works well, gives everybody an equal chance to have their voice heard. And I hope that people won't lose sight of that in their anger at the polls over how it might be treating their favorite candidate.
Listen, we appreciate the two of you. Jim and I really have learned a lot, and I know that viewer will appreciate it as well. And for those watching, you know, this is an important topic, especially right now. And we hope that this puts perspectives on things that matter with people who care, which is what we're trying to do. You can check McCuistionTV.com, follow us on Twitter, and join us on social media. And in any way you want to enjoy what we're doing, and poll and survey and let us know how you feel about things. Thank you for joining us.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.